Thank you, Savannah. One of my favorite sayings is that God created man and Samuel Colt made all men equal.
Yeah.
Savannah is living proof that actually Samuel Colt made men and women equal. Have you seen her shoot? She's a tough shot. I want to thank Savannah for getting constitutional carry passed in the House here in Frankfort. How about that? A lot of us like to complain about politicians, but there are a few good ones. In the Senate, you got Damon Thayer, who was instrumental in getting that constitutional carry passed, but we can't let up. I want to tell you how the Second Amendment became one of the most important things to me in my life. When I was 12 years old, on my birthday, my dad took me to the gun store, and he bought me a 12-gauge a 410-gauge H&R shotgun. And if you've noticed in these mass public shootings or these school shootings, there's like three things you see in common. Number one, the person normally didn't have a father, like the father wasn't present in the upbringing of the child. The other thing that you notice in these shootings is that a lot of times they're on some kind of medication. But one thing that I've noticed that nobody ever talks about is nobody ever took that kid hunting. And the Second Amendment, I'm going to be clear, is not about duck hunting and it ain't about squirrel hunting, okay? It's about keeping your government in check.
Yeah!
But it is important to take your kids hunting, because I think what you learn in that is how precious life is and how delicate it is. And when you shoot something, it's not like a video game. You can't undo it. You can't restart the game. It is forever once it happens. So I think the best thing you could do is to take your kid out, teach them to shoot, and teach them also how to hunt. Now, a lot of people say, well, if the Second Amendment is unrestricted and you can't infringe on it, can you have any kind of gun? What kind of guns? Where should you draw the line? Well, I see a lot of AR-15s and AR-10s here today. That is certainly a gun that you should be able to have. I'm here to tell you, because here's the way I look at it. If the police, when you call the police, and they're going to show up in 5, 10, maybe 30 minutes later with the gun that they believe they need to protect you, shouldn't you be allowed to have that gun until they get there? Yeah. The same kind of gun? Yeah. I hear a lot of people say, when they're talking about so-called reasonable gun control, they'll say, well, calm down. Nobody wants to take your guns. Yeah, right. Have you seen the people I serve with in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, indeed.
The ones that commit candor. You know what candor is, right? When you actually say what you're thinking. The ones that commit candor, they want to take your guns. Some of them want to take all of the guns from just a few people, and some of them want to take a few of the guns from all of the people. In the first case, I'm talking about red flag laws. You think they're going to show up and say, okay, give me your handgun and your semi-automatic, but you can keep that shotgun. No, they are going to take every single gun you have in the house, right down to a BB gun, if you get served with the red flag order, okay? And then if they have a so-called assault weapons ban again, do you think they're going to say, well, we're only going to take the so-called assault weapons from a few people? No, they're going to take them from everybody. So don't tell me nobody wants to take your guns. There are people in this Capitol want to take your guns right here in Kentucky.
Indeed. Yeah, from Louisville.
So that's one of the reasons that it is important that you are here. It's one of the reasons I established the Second Amendment caucus in Congress. You know, there was a Second Amendment caucus, and then everybody got complacent. And they thought, well, we're in the majority. We don't need a Second Amendment caucus. Gun control won't come out of the House or out of the Senate. But I realized that I was serving with a lot of people who didn't understand this issue as well as any of all of you here today understand the issue better than most of the people in Washington, D.C., the issue of the Second Amendment. I mean, the ones that get up and say, oh, I'm for the Second Amendment. I like duck hunting. Clearly, they don't understand the Second Amendment. So I established the Second Amendment caucus. And I get a lot of questions. People say, well, who's in the Second Amendment caucus? You know what? It's the only caucus in D.C. that doesn't have a registry. That's what I tell them. One of the reasons I did that, by the way, is a lot of people want to join the caucus, and then they want to vote against your right to keep and bear arms, and then when they catch heat at a town hall, they want to say, well, I'm in the Second Amendment caucus, I'm for the Second Amendment. Well, I'm not going to prove it for them, right? What you should stand by is not whether you're in some kind of caucus or not, or what you said in a pamphlet, or when you were running for office. You have to stand by your votes. So if you want to be pro-Second Amendment, then you're going to have a vote to prove it. You're not going to be able to just say, I'm in the Second Amendment caucus. But what I do there is I bring in individuals to educate congressmen. Some of these caucuses, they sit around and they just talk to each other. It's one politician talking to another. Everybody said it until, everybody just talks to each other as if they're going to get smarter talking to each other. That's never going to happen. So I bring in people from the outside. One of these people, who's a good friend of mine, you're going to meet later. I'm not introducing him yet, but Dick Heller is one of those people. I brought in Dick Heller's lawyer, Alan Gura. He didn't just win the DC versus Heller case. He also went on to win the McDonald versus Chicago case. Because the Heller case was important because it said that you have a right to keep and bear arms, and it is unconnected to membership in a militia. Everybody has the God-given right to keep and bear arms. But because it was decided in Washington, D.C., it didn't apply to the states. Can you believe that? So a few years later, we had to have another case called McDonald versus Chicago. And because that case happened in the states, that said every state, all 50 states, have to recognize the decision that we had in the Heller case just a few years before, that your right to keep and bear arms is absolute, and it's not connected to membership in a militia.
Yes.
So I brought in people like that. I brought in people like John Lott to educate the other congressmen. Also, I was able to organize a class. I got 15 congressmen trained in carrying concealed weapons now in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. All right.
A lot of them wanted to change the laws so they didn't have to do what the regular citizens had to do. I said, I can't co-sponsor that. We aren't better than anybody else. We got to live by the same laws that everybody else lives by. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the legislation in Washington, D.C., some of the good legislation and some of the ugly legislation. So first, with the good legislation, this is one of the reasons I started the Second Amendment Caucus, was to promote this legislation. The first, this is just common sense, but we need to pass the Hearing Protection Act.
Yeah.
That is, even in the countries where they have strict gun control, they do not regulate hearing protection, also known as a suppressor. And in the movies, they call them silencers. But these are things that protect your hearing. They would protect your child's hearing when you go hunting, when you go practice. But it takes like 9 months and $200 to get one, and you've got to register it and get fingerprinted. It's ridiculous for hearing protection. What are we thinking? So that's the hearing legislation, but I'm proud to promote it. I'm happy to promote it. Let me tell you about some of my legislation that I've introduced. Because frankly, I don't think we need another gun law. I think we need to repeal some of the gun laws we have.
Yeah.
The first and most important gun law that I think we need to repeal is the Federal Gun-Free School Zone Act.
Absolutely.
95% of mass public shootings happen in a gun-free zone. I can tell you there will not be a mass public shooting here today, okay? This is the last place there will be one. And we should not label our kids as sitting ducks. We should not do that with the federal law that says not only is the school a gun-free zone, but we're going to put a perimeter around the school and make criminals out of law-abiding citizens if they just so happen to drive through this perimeter. That is ridiculous. So my bill would repeal the Gun-Free School Zone Act, and I call it the Safe Students Act.
Yeah.
Now I want to tell you about a bill I just introduced yesterday. And the reason I put it in the hopper yesterday is so I could come here and tell you about it today. It's called the Safer Voter Act, okay? This is to sort of play with the liberals' mind, to sort of troll them a little bit. The name of the bill, Safer Voter, stands for 18. How old do you have to be to carry an M4 in Afghanistan? 18. What about shoot a 240 out the side of a Black Hawk? 18. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's unconstitutional, frankly. I think it's discrimination that you have to be 21 to buy a handgun from an FFL. If you are old enough to defend this country, to stand up for the Bill of Rights, to die for the Bill of Rights, why in the hell can't you buy a handgun and protect your family? I mean, we've got, for instance, you have men who are serving overseas and their wives are at home, 20-year-old wives, mothers, and they're going to tell me that the husband's overseas and she's taking care of the family at home and she can't go to an FFL and buy a handgun. That is absolutely ridiculous. And so my bill ties the age at which you can buy a handgun to the age at which you can vote and decide who the commander-in-chief is. They should be the same age, 18.
Amen.
Get rid of the FFL.
Now, let me tell you about some of the ugly legislation that's been going on in Washington, D.C. By the way, the only silver lining that I can see to this impeachment sham that's been going on is the Democrats lost all of their momentum for the gun control that they were trying to pass, and you all were able to regroup and form the Second Amendment sanctuary county movement in several states and push back against them while they're distracted with this sham. And when I was down in the SCIF, because I'm on the oversight committee, listening to the witness tryouts, before they called witnesses above ground, 3 floors underground, Adam Schiff had the witness tryout program, we called it. They'd bring them in there and we'd sit there, and I sat there for hours and hours, and I turned to my colleague and I said, you know, if sitting 3 floors underground and with Adam Schiff is the price we have to pay to not passing any gun control, I'll stay here until the next election. But they have lost momentum, fortunately, on one of the worst pieces of legislation that was gaining some momentum, and that is red flag laws. And by the way, those are going to be decided here in this Capitol. And that's where they should be decided, not in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
There's no constitutional nexus for Washington, D.C. to pass a red flag law. But what they had, the legislation they had teed up, was they were going to bribe the states with grants. And if you do this, and if you say, Mother May I, here in Frankfort, then Washington, D.C. would give you some money. And that's how they get the states and the legislators to comply and to knuckle under to this kind of stuff. Well, we've stopped, for now, we have stopped red flag laws. The other thing they had some momentum on that we've been able to stop is I call it the universal gun registry. Some people call it universal background checks, but make no mistake, this is about them wanting to know everybody in this country who has a gun and what gun do they have. It's a universal gun registry. It is not a universal background check. So far, we have been able to stop that in Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
Somebody yelled thank you. I want to yell thank you back for doing the Second Amendment sanctuary county movement. I see organizers from all the counties here, and I am very humbled by that. That is so important. People are saying, oh, it's just a resolution. It doesn't matter. I don't know why you're doing this. If it's just a resolution, why did some of these local elected officials have such a hard problem getting to yes? It gave you some insight into, number one, if that person decides to run for, instead of magistrate, now they're going to run for state rep, you know they don't need your vote if they can't even vote for a resolution that says they believe in the Second Amendment.
Right.
It's also important because these red flag laws, they're going to get tested in court, right? Somebody, and it's probably going to be a sheriff, is going to refuse to enforce these red flag laws. And there will be a court case. Remember Kim Davis? They threw her in jail for refusing to do something that the federal government told her to do, but our state constitution said you can't do. And so she didn't do it, and they threw her in jail. Well, somebody probably is going to go to jail over these red flag laws. In Colorado, there's a sheriff who stepped up. His name is Sheriff Steve Reams in Weld County, Colorado. he says, put me in jail. I will refuse to enforce these red flag laws because, number one, they're unsafe to my deputies. You want to throw us into that volatile situation? Number two, they're unconstitutional. And he says, instead of forcing one of my constituents to go to jail and then have to fight their way out of that through the court cases, put me in jail and I'll fight it all the way to the Supreme Court if I have to, is what this sheriff said. And his local county officials said, we will pay your court fees. So that's another reason why these sanctuary county movements are so important for the Second Amendment. I'm gonna wrap up here because there's somebody else far more important than me that came all the way from Washington, D.C. to speak. But before I do, I want to talk about executive orders and executive actions. There's some concern that the person living in that governor's mansion over there may try to pass an executive order or an executive action. Do you all remember when Obama did that? He had a list of like 29 things. One of the things that he tried to pass that he recommended was that he said every doctor, when you go to see your doctor, he said every doctor should say, do you have a gun in the house? You know what? You know what I'm going to tell my doctor? If my doctor says, do you have a gun in the house? I'm going to say, no, doc, I brought it with me. Now, I know what a lot of you are saying. Oh my gosh, he's a congressman and he carries an LCP? That's miserable. That's lame. But maybe you didn't see on Twitter, I lost all my other guns in a boating accident. All right. I'm just a kid that grew up in Lewis County, got his first gun when he was 12 years old. The Second Amendment was my gateway into the Constitution. I realized that if you don't have the ability to protect yourself against a tyrannical government, none of the rest of the Bill of Rights matters, and none of the Constitution matters, and nothing matters if you do not preserve this. And that is, frankly, my biggest issue. And that's what inspired me to get into politics, because I saw people who wanted to take away your God-given, not your government-given, your God-given right to keep and bear arms. And so,
Yeah.
amen. Can I get an amen? Yeah. All right. Well, this next guy is a hero. He is an absolute hero. And the remarkable thing you're going to find out, if you don't know this already, he's just a normal person, okay? But normal people can become heroes. And I'm always worried about meeting a hero, because you never know, is he as good as what he's made out to be? Is he as great? When you get to see your heroes up close, sometimes you wonder, man, how did this person ever get to be my hero? But when I got to Washington, D.C., one of the people I sought out was Dick Heller, because he lives in Washington, D.C. Still lives here. By the way, he's got a gun now. They should have gave it to him in 1976 when he asked for it.
Way to go, Dick!
So, but he is a legend. His court case is history, but he is living history, and he's a living legend, and he is here today. I have breakfast with him. I have lunch with him. I try to understand this man, what kept him inspired for 32 years to stand up and finally secure our Second Amendment rights for everybody in this country. And here's what I found out. The more I get to know Dick Heller, the more he is my hero. And so I am going to give you my hero now, Dick Heller.